There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
In the United States, Texas is known for being exceptionally tough on crime. For decades, it has consistently had the highest prison population of any state. It is the country's leader in prisoner executions, and thousands of people have been sentenced to spend the majority of their lives in Texan prison cells over nonviolent offenses. Few prisoners understand this better than the man known as King Con. Stephen J. Russell is one of the most infamous prison escape artists in American history. He has been described as a chameleon, having a nondescript appearance and the ability to alter his voice and persona to suit whatever situation he finds himself in. Throughout the 1990s, he used those skills to swindle over $1 million through various scams, and to make a complete mockery of the Texas penal system by simply walking out of prisons and jailhouses 4 times. But while he was smart enough to outwit his jailers, he would always be recaptured, for though he was a genius, he was ultimately a fool for love. His antics have been the subject of books, news articles, television shows, and even a feature film starring Jim Carrey and Ewan McGregor. But how exactly does a family man who worked as a volunteer police officer and played the organ at his local church end up with a life sentence in solitary confinement, despite never committing a violent crime? Let's find out in this episode of the Ruse Cruise. A quick disclaimer before we begin: if you've read online articles about Stephen, or if you've watched other YouTube videos which are largely based off of those articles, some of the information in this video will be new or different from details you've heard before. For the majority of this video, I got my information from I Love You, Phillip Morris, the Stephen Russell biography written by Steve McVicker in 2003. McVicker is a Houston-based journalist who reported on Stephen's last 2 escapes as the situation was unfolding in the late 90s, and he spent several years interviewing Stephen and other people in his life. In my opinion, Steve McVicker has done the most extensive work when it comes to verifying Stephen's story. Compare this to the articles in The Guardian and Esquire, who just ran with Stephen's narrative about all his escapes happening on Friday the 13th without bothering to check if he was lying about that, which he was. I don't want to slag these publications off entirely. They do have some useful interviews and information, but you can't just take the word of a career con man at face value. Also, since Stephen and Steve effectively have the same first name, to prevent any confusion going forward, whenever I refer to Stephen Russell, I'll call him Stephen, and anytime I refer to Steve McVicker, I'll either call him McVicker or his full name. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's get into the video. Stephen J. Russell was born on September 14, 1957. He grew up in the Tidewater area of Virginia with his parents and older brother. His father ran the family fruit distribution business, D.S. Russell & Sons, and his mother worked as a nurse. After school, Stephen and his brother would do odd jobs around the family business, though Stephen had dreams of being a garbage man, rather than follow in his father's and grandfather's footsteps. All in all, his childhood was fairly average, until the day his parents told him he had been adopted. His birth mother, Brenda Bosham, had put him up for adoption because she didn't have the money to care for both him and his older sibling after divorcing her husband, Stephen's father. The Boshams would later get back together and have more children once their financial situation improved, but they never made an effort to see the son they'd given up to the Russells in a hospital parking lot. This news deeply affected young Stephen. He began lashing out, getting into fights with other kids, and starting fires. His parents tried to help him through counseling with a local preacher, but when Stephen set fire to a classmate's locker and nearly burned down a wall in his school, local law enforcement forced him into a psychiatric hospital, followed by a juvenile correctional facility called the Hanover Boys' School. Decades later, Stephen would describe the place as, quote, the worst place on earth, unquote, as he recalled the abuse he and other boys would suffer at the hands of staff. At Hanover, Stephen discovered 2 things about himself. First, he realized he is gay. Second, he found he has a natural talent for manipulating people to get his way. You see, 4 months into his time at Hanover, it had been determined that Stephen needed dental braces, and he quickly figured out that every time he complained about his braces causing him pain, his counselors would have to take him to the nearest orthodontist, who was located over 30 miles away. So, he began to complain. A lot. And after 5 months of repeated trips to the dentist and untold amounts of wasted time and gas, his counselors told the judge he was well enough to go back home. Now, it's impossible to tell if it really was his braces scheme that got him out, or if the counselors genuinely thought he was reformed enough to return home. Whatever the case, Stephen would utilize these burgeoning observation and manipulation skills for the rest of his life. Once back home with his adoptive family, his father gave him a job at Russell & Sons, which was bumped up to a full-time administrative position after he graduated from high school. This opportunity, nepotistic as it may have been, was a chance for him to change his ways and leave behind the petty crimes of his youth. And in a way, it did change him. Stephen still wasn't interested in a lifelong career in the family business. He now had aspirations of being a police officer, not necessarily because he wanted to uphold the law, but because he knew it would give him access to information and databases that would help him find his biological parents. While trying to find work at local police departments, he met a police secretary named Debbie. 17 months later, the two were married and moved to Virginia Beach to start life together. Stephen began playing the organ at their local church. Following the birth of their daughter in 1979, he became a volunteer deputy at the Currituck County Police Department. To the public, Stephen seemed like an upstanding family man and member of the community. Under the surface, however, he was hiding some secrets. The first was his father's less-than-clean business practices, which introduced Stephen to the world of white-collar crime. D.S. Russell & Sons was involved in bid-rigging collusions with 2 other Virginia fruit distribution companies. Their goal was to edge out competitors on school meal contracts by setting prices so absurdly low that only they would win the contracts. Stephen expanded the scheme to include military commissaries. The plan worked for 2 years, until federal authorities from the Department of Justice started getting suspicious. Stephen agreed to work with the feds, handing over everything he knew, and wearing a wire to meetings. He also, by pure coincidence, faced no charges for his involvement in the collusion schemes. Meanwhile, his father and the other company leaders were convicted and fined. The second secret was his love of cruising in local parks and bathrooms for extramarital liaisons with other men. He was able to keep this hidden from his friends and family, even when he asked an undercover police officer for, quote, ABJ, unquote, and was charged with solicitation. Allegedly, his lawyer argued that all Stephen had said were the letters B and J, and the judge agreed and dropped the charges. It would take another near miss with solicitation charges for Stephen to stop prowling public areas for sex, though he would continue exploring his sexuality by dating men in secret. Stephen had managed to escape jail and keep his public reputation intact, but Virginia Beach was becoming less and less hospitable for him. After D.S. Russell & Sons went bankrupt, he couldn't get work with other local food distributors because he was known as a snitch. He couldn't get a job with law enforcement due to his history of criminal charges. He even tried to meet his biological mother, but she denied he was her son and turned him away. Just a year before his adoptive father passed away in 1985, Stephen decided to move all the way to Houston, Texas to get a job at Cisco and try to start over. Stephen moved to Houston by himself in 1984 to begin working. Debbie and their daughter would remain in Virginia until construction wrapped up on their new Texas home. Now on his own, Stephen felt free to be open about his sexuality and became familiar with Houston's art scene and the city's premier neighborhood, Montrose. There, his new friends and lovers introduced him to a world of finery he had never known back in Virginia. Giorgio Armani suits, new Corvettes, wining and dining at 5-star gourmet restaurants, operas and symphonies followed by weekend stays at the Four Seasons. Stephen immediately fell in love with this life of luxury, and perhaps developed a sense of entitlement for it. Once Debbie and his daughter joined him in Houston at the beginning of 1985, however, Stephen had to put his sexuality and cheating back under wraps. He was able to keep her in the dark for another 15 months, until he drove home from a one-night stand after drinking a little too much. When the police gave chase, Stephen tried to flee and ended up flipping his car. His injuries were so severe that he had to stay in intensive care at the hospital for 8 weeks. During that time, Debbie took over managing the family finances. She noticed Stephen's credit card bills had numerous charges for stays at hotels, and she correctly guessed that he had been cheating on her. Stephen denied it at first, saying those had been business expenses for out-of-town job applicants coming in for interviews. Once he had recovered enough to take care of himself again by December 1986, Debbie packed up and left for Virginia with their daughter. Before she walked out, Stephen finally came clean about his sexuality and infidelity. It would be years before they legally dissolved their marriage, but he and Debbie remain amicable to this day. Stephen spent another 2 years in Houston until he learned his employers were involved in price rigging. Not wanting to get stuck in another federal investigation, he started looking for new work. He moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career at S.E. Rykoff & Co., another produce company. Instead of simply submitting an application and crossing his fingers, he called Rykoff's offices and pretended to be the CFO of one of his former employers. He told them what a great employee Stephen was and pushed them to call him back. 3 months later, Rykoff hired him on as an assistant to the president of its LA branch. The lucrative job would last for less than a year. Stephen says he was fired because an employee outed him as gay to his superiors. Rykoff contends that they got spooked after creditors from Virginia began calling about Stephen's unpaid family debts, so they ran a background check, which led them to his old solicitation charges from Virginia and the truth behind the CFO call. Whichever party you choose to believe, Stephen was fired after just 7 months. He moved back to Houston to work for Conco. It was a short 5-month stay. He spent most of that time helping federal authorities with another trust-busting investigation involving some of his former Texas employers. It was, in part, retaliation against them for not hiring him back when he returned to Houston. Now a snitch twice over, Stephen believed his future in the food distribution business was completely over, so he prepared to move back to Virginia. Part of those preparations was securing some savings to fall back on while out of work, and he would do it by literally falling. Stephen faked a slip-and-fall accident at the apartment Conco had rented for him. He successfully scammed $45,000, worth about $100,000 today, from the apartment's insurance company by using his old back and pelvis injuries from the 1986 car accident to make his ruse more convincing. Once the money was in his pockets, he left for his home state in the summer of 1990. Back in Virginia, Stephen had a chance encounter with a woman named Deborah Bosham. He immediately recognized the surname, and after a brief conversation, they figured out her husband, Mitch, was Stephen's biological brother. With Deborah and Mitch's help, Stephen was finally able to meet his biological family and confront his birth mother for a second time. This time, she finally let down her walls and welcomed Stephen into the family. While things were improving with his birth family, the rest of Stephen's life was going downhill. He didn't have a job, and the $45,000 from the insurance fraud earlier that year was starting to run dry. He sold his 2 Rolex watches for some money, which sparked an idea for a new source of income. Rolexes sold quickly and for several $1,000s apiece. If he could get more watches, he'd be financially set for some time. But he couldn't just buy and resell. There would be no profit in that. So he decided to steal the identity of another Stephen Russell from Virginia. He purchased more Rolexes on credit in the man's name, then sold those to another jeweler for $6,000 cash each. He even got a driver's license under the other Stephen's name. The Guardian reported that Stephen had been selling fake Rolexes, but a Virginia police officer who knew him at the time confirmed the real watches procured through identity theft story is what actually happened. During his frauds in Virginia, Stephen briefly returned to Houston to visit a friend. While staying there, he applied for a passport using the name of yet another Stephen Russell. He figured it might come in handy if his Virginia frauds were uncovered, which they inevitably were. The other Stephen from Virginia notified the police when he started getting bills for the watches. Stephen, that is Stephen J. Russell, never got the chance to use his fake passport before Virginia police caught up to him. He pled guilty to fraud charges and was given 5 years probation, which he violated almost immediately by running off to Florida during the summer of 1991. On the lam in the Sunshine State, Stephen met a bellhop at the Four Seasons in Palm Beach. The bellhop's name was James Kemple. Stephen would come to know him as Jimmy. The two fell head over heels in love for one another, and thus began Stephen's first serious relationship with another man. Unfortunately, James had HIV. The state of AIDS treatment in the 90s meant he only had a few more years left to live. So Stephen spent every moment with James and spoiled him rotten with the considerable wealth he was making at the time by working as a tomato broker for Costco. He would take his new partner out to the movies at least twice a week, show him the finest restaurants in town, and bought 3 miniature Dobermans for him. They moved into an apartment together after just 2 months of dating. Life was going good for the first time in over a year, but Stephen could only run from his legal problems for so long. In November 1991, just a month after he and James had moved in together, Stephen was convicted for passport fraud in Houston in order to serve 6 months in federal prison. The investigation had also uncovered the truth behind the insurance fraud with the slip and fall, though he had yet to be convicted on those charges. Authorities gave him until April to get his affairs in order and report to prison. He never told James about his impending incarceration. Just before he was scheduled to begin serving his sentence, Stephen attempted to take his own life 3 times. After the 3rd attempt, he was flown out to Houston. As luck would have it, the federal prisons in the state didn't have enough room, and he was instead placed in Harris County Jail, an overcrowded facility with an overstretched staff. The perfect conditions for Stephen to make his first of many escapes. Stephen had no intention of staying in jail, not when James might not survive long enough to see him again as a free man. Another 6 months had been added to his sentence for failing to report to prison on time, and he was staring down the barrel of another 10 years max if convicted for the insurance fraud. He decided he had to get out as soon as possible, so he got to work devising a plan. Step 1. Reconnaissance. He began by observing the guard patrols, taking note of their whereabouts and actions throughout the day. He noticed the guards manning the 10th floor station separating the jail from the visitation area were rather lax in letting each other or visiting police officers through the doors, without checking for an ID or badge. Many of the guards would also step outside every 3 hours for a smoke break, leaving the jailhouse largely unmanned. If he could get past the station while the guards weren't paying attention, it was a straight shot to the unlocked front doors. Step 2. Get a job. Getting a job doing jailhouse duties, or becoming a trustee as it's called, would grant Stephen access to more areas of the jail, which would help with further guard observation and give him opportunities to search for escape routes. During one of his quote-unquote bathroom breaks, he found a room where the street clothes and personal belongings from new inmates were held prior to being moved to storage. By wearing civilian clothing instead of his assigned prisoner outfit, he could try to pass himself off as a visiting undercover police officer. But he'd need more than just the t-shirt and bright red stretch pants he'd swiped that day in order to complete his disguise. Step 3. Radios and sandwiches. Stephen noticed that the nurse's office had police radios within reach of the prisoners, but he couldn't just distract her out of the blue and grab one. She'd know it was him as soon as she saw something was missing. So he began taking leftover sandwiches from the guard's lunchroom and bringing them to her to snack on while making small talk. After a couple weeks of making himself a part of the nurse's daily routine, he finally grabbed a radio when she had her back turned during one of their luncheon chats. His disguise now complete, there was just one last thing he needed to do before making a break for it. Step 4. Find outside help. To get the longest possible head start before the guards realized he was gone, Stephen would need help once outside the prison. He tried calling the phone number of a former coworker and friend in Houston to confirm he had the right number. His old friend picked up on the other end. Stephen hung up without saying a word. They couldn't talk on the monitored jailhouse phone lines. For now, he had all he needed. Step 5. Escape. When the guards left for their smoke break on the evening of Wednesday, May 13th, 1992, Stephen took another one of his bathroom breaks and put his plan into motion. He switched into the pants and shirt he'd swiped, then threw his jailhouse jumpsuit back on to cover them up. He hid the radio in a paper sandwich bag and took an elevator up to the jailhouse gymnasium. He knew it would be empty at that time of night. Once the elevator doors opened, he dumped his jumpsuit and the empty bag onto the gym floor and took the elevator back down to the 10th floor. Now disguised, Stephen walked down the hall towards the guard station that stood between him and freedom. He tapped the police radio against the glass to get the guards' attention and give himself the appearance of authority. All he could do was pray they would be their usual lazy selves and not ask questions. The guard turned to look at him and hit the button to open the gates. Stephen walked out, past the guard station, through the visitation room, took an elevator to the first floor, and waltzed right out the front door. He had only been in Harris County Jail for a month. But he couldn't rest just yet. He managed to flag down a passing car and convince the driver that he was a cop who needed a lift to the Hyatt Regency in Houston. During the drive, he listened to the police radio for signs they'd noticed he was missing. So far, it was quiet. At the hotel, he rang up his old friend again. This time, he stayed on the line and spun a story about needing a change of clothes and $300 to get back home to Virginia. In actuality, he was headed to Florida to get back to James. His friend bought the story and arrived with the requested items, then drove Stephen to the Houston International Airport. Stephen spent the night at a nearby motel, listening to the stolen radio as the police finally realized he was gone. Using his knowledge of police lingo and radio procedure, he tried to throw the guards off his trail by pretending to be an officer who saw a man matching Stephen's description near the Hobby Airport. Afterwards, he called James and told him to come to the Miami airport the next morning. Within a week, the two were on flights to Mexico. The escape to Mexico did not last long. Stephen was dissatisfied with the work he found there, and he was worried about the quality of medical care James was receiving, so they moved back to the States. They stayed in New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Illinois, unable to be in one place for too long, lest they risk police detection. For a time, Stephen tried to be a typical employee, well, as typical as a prison escapee on the run could be, but within a few months, he was finding excuses to dip his hand into the proverbial cookie jar. In Florida, he swiped over $7,000 from a fast food restaurant, in what he says was revenge after his boss refused to let him use a chair with back support for his chronic back pain. In Illinois, he took $45,000 in phony business expenses from NutraSweet and committed insurance fraud by signing off on health insurance and life insurance policies with James's name. Both times he managed to escape any charges. Stephen would later write in his 2018 autobiographical play, Life After Phillip Morris, quote, "I certainly don't think I'm too good for a 9-to-5 job. I just think I was underappreciated. Whenever I broke the law, it was the result of a simple weighing up of all the options available to me. None of the legitimate options recognized the considerable skills that I have, or the risks I was prepared to take." Unquote. During their 2-year cross-country run from the police, James's health deteriorated more and more as his HIV progressed into AIDS. They moved back to Florida so James could spend his remaining months with his family, who he had been largely separated from during his 2-year run with Stephen. In a 2010 interview with Esquire magazine, James's mother, Helen Kemple, had the following to say about the man who dragged her terminally ill son across the country. Quote, "I really liked Stephen at first, but he conned Jimmy. He lied like a rug. He told one lie after another, and he deserves to be in prison 100% because he'll do it all again." Unquote. In preparation for the move to Florida, Stephen took out a life insurance policy in James's name and sold it to a viatical company in exchange for $330,000. For those who don't know what viaticals are, they're companies that buy life insurance policies from terminally ill people, with the intent being that the customer can use that money to enjoy their remaining life, and the company collects the full policy amount when the customer dies. Stephen used the earnings to pay for his partner's health care and a down payment on a Coral Springs house. He also got a job at DCI Limited, who were set to pay him $75,000 a year to oversee the financial departments of the company and one of its subsidiaries. But Stephen felt that itch once more, and he began writing himself paychecks from both companies, doubling his salary. He also took out more health insurance and life insurance policies in James's name. This time, however, his luck had run out. DCI caught wind of what he was doing and got the police involved. Stephen and James made a run for Philadelphia, but they were caught almost as soon as they arrived. The two were charged with federal insurance fraud. James paid his bail, and the prosecutors dropped the charges against him when his doctors explained how he was nearing the end of his life. He returned to Florida to be with his mother, sister, and the dog Stephen had gotten for him 2 years earlier. Stephen remained in custody at the federal prison in Fairton, New Jersey. After escaping jail and running for 2 years to be with Jimmy, he was unable to be with him on his final days. James Kemple died on July 17, 1994. He was only 28 years old. Stephen was heartbroken over the loss of his boyfriend, but he was also inspired by the way prosecutors had dropped the charges once they understood James was dying. As luck would have it, one of the other inmates that Stephen met at Fairton was a doctor who had smuggled some of his medical office's stationery into the prison. Everything was in place for Stephen to weasel his way out of federal custody yet again. Prisoners are allowed access to their personal medical records, so Stephen got a hold of his and slipped in some fake lab reports which indicated he was suffering from late-stage AIDS. Then, using the doctor's office stationery from his friend, he wrote a bogus doctor's note about his fake HIV status and sent it to the prosecutors overseeing his case. Quote, "It is with great sadness that I tell you, Mr. Russell is in the final stages of his illness and will soon succumb to it within the next months." Unquote. But he couldn't just try to sell this con on paper. At 250 pounds and in relatively good health, he didn't exactly look the part of someone dying from AIDS. So he stopped eating, lost a significant amount of weight, laid in bed most of the time to emulate lethargy, and even trained himself to become incontinent. The New Jersey prosecutors and prison staff bought it, without ever bothering to give him a blood test to verify his supposed diagnosis. And because they incorrectly believed they had retrieved all the money that Stephen had stolen from DCI, they agreed to drop the charges against him. He was all set to walk out of prison a free man, having once again duped the authorities. But the state of Texas had other plans. Unaware, or uncaring, of his supposed fatal prognosis, they extradited him back to Houston. They still wanted their pound of flesh for the insurance fraud conviction, and now even more for the 1992 escape. The state of Texas sentenced Stephen to 3 years in prison for his slip-and-fall scam and the jailhouse escape. They sent him back to the Harris County Jail. Though, to be fair, this time it was only temporary until they could send him to Huntsville, the heart of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, or TDCJ for short. Thankfully for them, Stephen had lost the aspiration to escape. He no longer had a boyfriend dying on the outside. He also knew he'd get early parole, as his offenses had all been nonviolent, so he dropped the phony age charade and prepared to keep his head low until he could get out legitimately. Ironically, this would result in Stephen meeting the man who would one day be his inspiration for 3 more escapes from incarceration. You wouldn't think an overpopulated jailhouse with a tuberculosis problem would be the kind of place where a person can find love, but for Stephen, it was. It began with a meet-cute straight out of a sappy romance novel. He saw a fellow inmate, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed southern man, barely over 5 foot tall, struggling to reach a book on a shelf in the jailhouse law library. And Stephen, being over 6 foot, decided to give him a hand. The other man introduced himself as Phillip Morris. He was serving time for failing to return a rental car. There was an immediate spark between the two, which quickly developed into a romantic relationship. The pair spent every possible waking moment together. Stephen would comfort Phillip whenever he cried, and paid off other prisoners to ensure anyone who gave him a rough time was beaten up. But Stephen's devotion would spiral into an obsession, one which was not always beneficial for Phillip. When Phillip told Stephen he was trying to find legal help for a friend, Stephen lied and told him he was a lawyer, a lie he would maintain even after their release. In a 2010 interview with the Houston Chronicle, Phillip accused Stephen of interfering with his parole opportunities in order to forcibly keep them together. Quote, "When we were in Harris County Jail, my lawyer told me they were going to reinstate my probation, that I was going to be out of there. Well, instead, when I came back to my cell, Steve was there, all happy and smiling. He had called the judge, pretending to be another judge or the DA, so I would not be getting out that night. He did that to make sure I wouldn't go back to my ex-lover. He wanted to make sure he got out before I got out." Unquote. I wasn't able to find any verification for this claim, but for what it's worth, Stephen never addressed it specifically when he responded to this interview years later to deny Phillip was a victim. There is confirmation Stephen committed similar acts later in the timeline as well. With these two factors, I feel Phillip's accusation is at least a possibility that can't be written off. How much stock you want to put into it is up to you. However, Phillip was not without severe fault himself. In one of Stephen's personal journal entries documented by McVicker, he complained that Phillip had physically assaulted him in late 1995 during an argument over Phil's drinking, and Phillip confirmed he had tried to push Stephen out of a window during another fight in '96. Quote, "It was glass from floor to ceiling, and the window bowed. If that thing had given way, I'd be sitting on death row." Unquote. But these problems would not surface for months to come. Getting back to the timeline, Stephen was correct to assume he'd get out early. After being incarcerated for just 9 months of his 3-year sentence, he was granted parole in October 1995. Almost immediately, he cashed out the last of the life insurance policies he'd taken out in James's name, in order to secure $25,000. He also took on an alias, Stephen Ruse, and pretended to be Phillip's new lawyer so they could spend unlimited private time together whenever he visited the prison in Huntsville. A month before Phillip was scheduled to be released on parole, Stephen called the parole offices and convinced them to let him out ahead of schedule. They celebrated first with a breakfast at Denny's, then an evening of shrimp and champagne. As soon as Phillip was out, Stephen jumped right back into the kind of opulent lifestyle he'd enjoyed in Montrose back in the 80s. Sailing trips off the coast of Key West, weekends at hotels just for fun, dining out almost every night at the best restaurants in town. Although that last one was nixed. Phillip had diabetes, and Stephen opted for home-cooked meals in order to better manage his condition. But all this spending was not compatible with Stephen's part-time job and the $25,000 nest egg. He needed to find a new gravy train to fund the kind of lifestyle he'd been planning since meeting Phillip in the jail library. Stephen started putting out ads in local papers for fake high-ranking accounting positions at Fortune 500 companies, with his address listed as the place to send resumes. He then took the resumes sent to him and compiled them to create his own phony CV, with credentials that would wow potential employers. On paper, he was a former CFO for Prudential, a software developer for IBM, and had a law degree from the University of Tennessee. Of course, he couldn't just rely on his stellar credentials to get a job. He tapped back into his phone impersonation skills that he'd used to get the position at Reichhoff. The numbers for his references were for answering machines he had set up. Once potential employers left a message, he'd call them back pretending to be his own references and sing his own praises. His scheme worked, and on January 23, 1996, Stephen was hired to be the chief financial officer for the HMO company North American Medical Management, NAMM for short. They never even bothered to run a background check on him.
You stupid.
Stephen quickly impressed NAMM by finding a way to make money on the millions of dollars they held for short periods of time. They'd been keeping the money in accounts that earned zero interest. Stephen moved the funds to accounts where they would accrue interest, then used that interest money to play the stock market. Soon he was making over $100,000 a month for the company. What NAMM didn't know was the money Stephen was reporting was only 50% of the investment returns, with the other 50% going into his own pockets. They also didn't know that he was cashing out old unclaimed paychecks for himself and writing checks to pay off bogus invoices for financial audits performed by a Dr. P.C. Morris. Over the course of 5 months, Stephen embezzled just over $800,000, worth about $1.5 million today. He claims he had plans to rob them blind of another $22 million. In an October 2011 interview with Pink News, Stephen explained his theft by saying, quote, "The HMOs put Jim and I through hell during his illness. They wouldn't cover the cost of certain treatments. At NAMM, I watched executives badger their medical directors to put pressure on network physicians to get patients out of the hospital as soon as possible, because otherwise it would affect their bonus. That got my revenge genes all greased up. I decided to make NAMM pay for their deeds, as well as the other HMO's deeds towards Jimmy." Unquote. Now, I'm not here to cry about something as soulless as a health insurance company getting ripped off, especially one that didn't think to run a background check on the guy they were putting in charge of their bank accounts, but let's not kid ourselves here. Stephen wasn't a modern-day Robin Hood stealing from the corporations to give to those suffering from HIV. The money he took went entirely towards creating a grandiose life for himself and Phillip. He spent nearly $200,000 just on Mercedes-Benzes for the both of them. And then there was the matching jet skis, Cartier watches and Rolexes for over $25,000 each, a $16,000 sliding glass door for a house they weren't even planning on staying in because they were eyeing up a neighborhood where housing prices start at $500,000. It was this extravagant spending that made his coworkers suspicious, but it would take the bank's scrutiny for Stephen's embezzlement to be discovered. Stephen knew he'd been caught on May 13th, when his boss began making weird excuses to avoid talking to him. He fled his office and took out $40,000 from ATMs on the way back to his and Philip's home. Philip refused to take the money, angered that he was now implicated in the embezzlement scheme. For years, he and Stephen would swear he was innocent, despite the fact Philip's signature was on at least one of the checks for Dr. P.C. Morris. It wouldn't be until 2018 that Stephen, in retaliation against Philip's Houston Chronicle interview, changed his story and said Philip was in on it the whole time. When Philip refused to take the $40,000, Stephen had it sent to Debbie back in Virginia. After a few days of cat and mouse with Harris County Police, Stephen was arrested on May 23, 1996. As he was being forced into the squad car, Stephen convinced the arresting officers he was diabetic and needed the insulin Philip kept at the house. He injected himself with 40 doses worth of the drug, and what he claims was an attempt to end his life. Philip and the police believe it was a ploy to give him time to think of an escape plan. The overdose sent him into shock, and he was taken to the hospital. There he remained for several days, until he was well enough to be transported to Harris County Jail yet again. For his part in the NAMM embezzlement, Philip was held on a $40,000 bond. He paid it off and was released pending trial. Stephen was not so lucky. His bond was set to $900,000, and the prosecution was gunning for a 45-year sentence. With his access to Philip cut off, and facing the potential of spending the rest of his life behind bars, Stephen felt he had nothing to lose by escaping once again. He had a bond hearing coming up on Friday, July 12th. He knew how the bond system works in prison, and he knew how to exploit it. The plan would require him to alter both the physical and digital records pertaining to his bail, both located within the county clerk's office. He started by drafting a mock-up of the court order he would need to reduce his bail. Then he mailed those to a friend in Florida who created printed, official-looking copies that declared his bail to be set at a much more manageable $45,000. But they couldn't mail the fake order to the county clerk. Stephen needed to ensure it was in their office on the same day as his bond hearing, and before the actual records from that day's hearing arrived. So the friend sent the documents back to him. Then, while being escorted to the courtroom for his bail hearing, Stephen discreetly dropped the papers on the floor when he passed by a court employee carrying a stack of documents. He called out to the guards and told them the woman had accidentally dropped something on the floor. They grabbed the papers and took them to the county clerk's office. That afternoon after his hearing, one of the guards let Stephen know they'd been notified of his reduced bail. His fake court order had fooled the clerk's office and been processed. Now he needed to make sure the digital records matched what was on paper. He had less than 12 hours to do it. Harris County cut off prisoner releases after 1 a.m., and the real bond orders from that morning's hearing would be on the county clerk's desk the next morning. His only option was to call. But phone calls from within the jail always began with an operator notifying the person on the other end about where the call was coming from. So he enlisted the help of his Florida friend once again, and had them patch him through to the county clerk's office via conference call, bypassing the operator notice that would give him away. Once he was on the line with the clerk's secretary, he pretended to be the judge overseeing his case, and told her he had made a mistake on Stephen's bond. Quote, "I've already sent a hard copy of the order over to the jail. I just need for you to make the change in the computer records." Unquote. The secretary complied. As soon as the call was over, Stephen had his friend patch him through to a local bonding agency. This time he impersonated his own lawyer, and asked them to bail Stephen out in exchange for payment the following Monday. A few hours later, one of the bondsmen came with the cash to get him out, and a car to take him to Philip in Galveston. Just after 8 p.m. on Friday, July 12, 1996, Stephen broke out of the Harris County Jail for a second time. When he was reunited with his beloved, Stephen tried to convince Philip to run off to Florida with him. Philip refused. He wasn't legally allowed to leave the county per the restrictions of his bond, and he didn't want to risk his case, which he still thought he could win. But Stephen had already made the choice for him. His obsession with Philip was in full swing, and he would not be parted from his boyfriend again. The following morning, he called the Harris County District Clerk's office, pretending to be a local deputy, and asked them to help him play a prank on his friend. They convinced Phillip he had a warrant out for his arrest for violating the terms of his bail. He believed it and panicked. Seeing no other options, he agreed to make a run to Florida with Stephen. The two men traveled separately so the police wouldn't catch them both. Once in a motel room in Fort Lauderdale, Stephen called Debbie's lawyer, then Debbie herself, and demanded she give him back the $40,000 he'd sent over prior to his last arrest. It turned out she didn't have it. As soon as the money had hit her doorstep, she'd given it to her attorney to send back to Texas law enforcement. Looking back, Stephen suspects that the police had tapped Debbie's phone by that point, because within hours of that call, police were banging on his motel door. Before opening the door and turning himself over, he made a call to tip off Phillip, who drove back to Houston. Stephen was arrested and taken back to Texas after just 3 days of freedom. The Harris County Police weren't fucking around anymore. They ordered that Stephen be shackled whenever outside of his cell and, more importantly, banned him from using the telephones. Just as they'd hoped, Stephen pled guilty to the NAMM charges almost as soon as these restrictions were implemented. He was sentenced to 45 years in state prison. When Harris County deputies transported him to the Maximum Security Estelle Unit of the TDCJ in October, they warned the guards and warden about the need to limit Stephen's movements and access to communications. These warnings went largely unheeded. Relatively free to move around once again, Stephen immediately began searching for a way to reunite with Phillip. It turned out his best bet was a repeat of his first escape back in '92. The graveshift guard manning the station between his unit and the doors to the front gate was lazy and constantly chatting on the phone. But now there was the matter of the front gate, and the gate guards who would ask questions of someone trying to leave in street clothes. Stephen would need something more convincing than a t-shirt and red pants. He channeled his days from Hanover and got into the medical unit by complaining about an eye problem. As he wandered the halls while waiting for his appointment, he took note of the prison dialysis patients, who were dressed in white pants and white scrubs, with the medical unit initials embroidered on the breast pocket. He also noticed the clothes the prison doctors wore, green pants and green scrubs, with the medical unit initials embroidered on the breast pocket. A couple of laundry duty trustees sold him some prisoner scrubs and white pants. Then he bought green markers off every prisoner who had a pack from the commissary. At nights, alone in his cell, Stephen would test how to dye his new disguise. After a few experiments, he figured it out. He could mix just the right amount of marker ink with water in his sink, soak the clothes in his homemade dye, then sandwich them between blankets and towels on his mattress to dry them without drawing attention or leaving telltale streaks. The result was close enough to the real thing to pass detection, so long as he didn't cross paths with someone who was actually medical staff. When the call came for breakfast at 3 a.m. on Friday, December 13th, 1996, Stephen put on the fake doctor scrubs and pants under his usual prison uniform and went down to eat. Afterwards, he went to a bathroom near the psych evaluation office, then stripped down to his disguise. The guards, the ones actually doing their jobs anyway, were none the wiser as they opened the front gate for the doctor and led him out into the parking lot. Stephen walked until he was out of sight of the gate guards before turning around, giving them the bird, and making a run for the woods. As soon as the sun rose, he came across a small neighborhood. He had no trouble making one of the homeowners believe he was a doctor who had crashed his car and needed a trip into town. The man took him to the Denny's in Huntsville, the same Denny's that he and Phillip had celebrated their early parole at just a year earlier. From there, Stephen hailed a cab and had the driver take him to Herman Hospital in Houston, over 75 miles away. At the hospital, he convinced the cabbie he would pay her once he got his wallet that he'd left inside. He ran in and asked the doctor where he could find a change of scrubs. They pointed him to the supply closet. He ditched the TDCJ scrubs for some new ones, and left through another part of the building, leaving the cabbie high and dry. Several other cabs and bus trips later, he was back at Phillip's place. Stephen couldn't afford to stay in Texas, not when his face was on the front page of local newspapers the next morning, and Phillip was also wanted for jumping bail months earlier. So together, they fled to Biloxi, Mississippi, using money Stephen was able to borrow from some old friends. They stayed at the Grand Casino Hotel, gambling on the tables and slots while they planned their next move. They decided they would head to Philadelphia. They would ride to the Amtrak on Christmas Eve and ring in New Year's as free men. Both were arrested on December 23, 1996, when Stephen crossed paths with a U.S. Marshal who recognized his face. Back in Huntsville, Stephen now faced additional felony charges for his escape. Phillip was placed in the Dallas County Jail to await trial for his part in the NAMM embezzlement. Stephen was convinced that the charges against his partner could be dropped with a good enough lawyer, but finding that kind of help while behind prison bars would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, so he set about finding yet another way to escape. This time, however, a simple escape wouldn't do. So long as the authorities knew he was on the run, they would hunt him. In order to enact his plan and live as a free man, Stephen had one option: convince the state he was dead. And, through personal experience and information from medical texts in the prison library, he had just enough knowledge of a specific terminal illness to make such a con work. It couldn't be quick and dirty like his scheme in New Jersey back in '94. The TDCJ was on high alert to his trickery, and would surely catch on to such a short-sighted plot. This time, it would have to be the longest con he ever pulled. So, for the next 15 months, Stephen set about convincing the state of Texas that he was dying from AIDS. He began by eating only half of his meal rations for weeks, then cutting that down further to 1/4, in order to begin losing a substantial amount of weight. In the meanwhile, he used the prison library typewriters to craft fake medical documents, which said he was HIV positive. He got access to his medical records and placed the fake papers inside. A simple blood test would have revealed his fraud, but the TDCJ medical facilities never ran such a test to confirm Stephen's diagnosis. This may have been due partially to them constantly moving Stephen to new units every few months in order to thwart escape attempts. Every time he moved, so too did his medical documents, and the new doctors would assume they were legitimate. The short time he was at each unit also limited the time the busy doctor offices had to poke and prod at him. And, of course, there was also the negative stigma towards gay men and those infected with HIV. Stephen would eventually include laxatives and self-induced vomiting to lose even more weight and mimic the symptoms of late-stage AIDS. As the months passed and he wasted away, he would spend more and more time lying in bed to mimic lethargy, even though his muscles ached from the lack of movement. His doctors began to petition the state for what's known as a special needs parole, which allows terminally ill prisoners to be released into hospice care for their remaining lives. The doctors also successfully got the charges for the last prison escape dropped. They thoroughly believed that Stephen had only months to live, and therefore, any court proceedings would be a waste of time. In October 1997, after nearly a year of barely eating and barely moving, Stephen made a final push to be granted specialized parole. For several days he hoarded the blood pressure medication and sleeping pills he'd been prescribed, then took them all at once to put himself into a 4-day coma. This finally convinced the TDCJ that he was weeks away from dying, and they agreed to send him to hospice care in Restful Acres to live out what doctors thought would be his final days. Once at the hospice facility, Stephen asked to be left alone to die in peace. Then, using the phone in his room, he impersonated Dr. Adam Rios, a real Houston physician specializing in HIV and AIDS treatment. He called both the nursing home's lead physician and the director of the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, asking for patients that would like to participate in an experimental treatment for HIV. They set Dr. Rios up with Stephen. On Friday, March 13th, 1998, Stephen was released from Restful Acres to an awaiting taxi that would bring him to Houston for the experiment. In actuality, the taxi took him to a car dealership, where he purchased a car. Then, after somehow procuring some medical scrubs, he posed as a doctor and got access to a nursing home where he snatched some blank death certificates. He created a fake death certificate for himself and sent off copies to his parole officer and to Restful Acres. In the eyes of the state of Texas, Stephen J. Russell was dead. Now that he had mastered the art of escaping and convinced the government he was 6 feet under, Stephen set his sights on yet another escape. But not for himself. This time, he was going to bust Phillip out of jail. So, he got to work devising a plan. Step 1. Set up a base of operations. Stephen found an apartment in Galveston that didn't require a background check. He was quickly approved for it by pretending to be Art Sandler, the man who had bought his father's company over a decade earlier. Now with a place to rest his head, he could dedicate himself to finding a way to get Phillip out. Step 2. Steal over $3,000 worth of furniture through identity fraud. Okay, I don't really know why he did this one other than the guy has expensive tastes, but the important thing is he told a furniture store that he had been transferred to Texas from Florida for work. Step 3. Get a driver's license. Stephen would need more documentation for his new stolen identity. Oklahoma didn't require fingerprinting in order to get a driver's license, so he somehow managed to get a copy of Art Sandler's birth certificate. then got on a plane to Oklahoma City and took advantage of their threadbare license requirements to get official government ID for his fake identity. Step 4. Become Phillip's lawyer. Stephen began searching through attorneys in the Houston area and realized it would cost at least $50,000 to hire someone for Phillip's case. He didn't have that kind of money yet, but with his new fake identity, he could get it, plus a few extra thousand to coast off of for a while. In the meantime, he needed to talk to Phillip about his plan, and he needed total privacy to do so, a privilege only granted to lawyers visiting their clients. So he impersonated Texas attorney Gene Lewis and called the State Bar Association, pretending that he'd lost his bar card and needed a new one. Once he picked up the card from their offices, he made a beeline for the Dallas County Jail. Step 5. Don't escape. To Stephen's dismay, Phillip had no interest in going along with his scheme to get a $75,000 loan in Art Sandler's name. He also believed he could dodge the charges, but he didn't want to get involved in another one of Stephen's cons, asking, quote, "Why don't you just get a job?" unquote. Stephen left the Dallas County Jail, contemplating his boyfriend's words. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time for Stephen to turn his life around and make an honest effort at raising the $50,000. No, I'm just kidding. He'd already called Nations Bank before visiting Phillip. Step 6. Fuck it. Escape anyway. Stephen made the drive to Nations Bank to finish filing for the loan. Unfortunately, the bank wasn't as easy to dupe as he thought they'd be. They got suspicious and called security. The guards escorted Stephen to a back room where they dug through his possessions. Stephen had gotten sloppy. He had both the fake Art Sandler's driver's license and the fake Gene Lewis bar card on him. He was promptly arrested, and the guards called the FBI. In order to escape the trap he'd fallen into, Stephen faked a heart attack. The stunt did get him out of the bank and into a hospital room, but his door was guarded by police. Luckily, they weren't actually in his room, nor were they watching him too closely. So he grabbed the phone in his room and called the police dispatcher. This time he posed as an FBI agent and told the officer on the other end that federal authorities had decided to let Stephen go. Without even asking for proof, the police complied and stepped down. Stephen walked out of his hospital room unhindered, but with his cover blown, he had to get out of Texas as quickly as possible. Step 7. Run. Unbeknownst to Stephen, his actions with the state bar had already tripped red flags before he'd even walked into the bank. They began circulating pictures of him to law enforcement agencies throughout the state. One of the officers who arrested him in '96 recognized him and started tracking him down. In the meanwhile, Stephen flew back to Galveston, packed his things, and caught the soonest flight to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Once there, he went right back to his usual tactics. He stole the identity of an attorney who represented him years ago in Virginia, got some money from an old friend, got a loan from a bank, and drafted life insurance policies for himself, which he turned around and sold to viatical companies under the guise he was terminally ill with AIDS. He didn't just need money for Phillip's legal fees now. He was going to get plastic surgery to alter his face and dodge detection for a while longer. The Texas police who were hunting him had talked with the furniture store he stole from and found out about the Florida story. They also traced Phillip's incoming calls, which also pointed to Florida. To narrow down where he was and the name to look out for, they called viatical companies in Florida, correctly assuming that Stephen had gone back to the life insurance frauds he used back in '94. Sure enough, they got a hit for a guy who had recently sold a life insurance policy because he was supposedly dying from AIDS. They told a Florida special agent about the case, and he tracked Stephen down to his apartment. On April 5th, 1998, as Stephen walked out of his apartment and picked up antibiotics in preparation for his upcoming plastic surgery, he was arrested by Florida police. He'd been free for 23 days. As of the publishing of this video, those days were the last time he'd ever live outside of a prison cell. Stephen's actions from 1992 to 1998 had brought into question the competency of Texas law enforcement. As Steve McVicker put it, quote, "You think, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me 4 times, someone is asleep at the switch." Unquote. How could citizens feel safe if the police couldn't even keep convicts inside maximum security prisons? I won't pretend that Stephen never hurt anybody. Stealing people's identities and leaving them with thousands of dollars in bills, even if they don't have to pay it in the end, does harm them psychologically. But he wasn't a violent offender, and while he did deserve to spend time in prison, what the Texas Department of Criminal Justice ended up doing to him was nothing short of heinous. The TDCJ came down on Stephen with fire and fury for his years of exposing the gaping holes in their prison security systems. The prosecutor on his latest felony escape case, who was also the sister-in-law of a NAMM executive he'd worked under, brought back the escape charge from '96 and pushed for a life sentence using Texas laws that allow for such extreme sentencing in the case of third-time felony offenders, regardless of the nature of their crimes. The judge agreed, and Stephen was sentenced to 144 years in prison. He will be eligible for release in 2142. Phillip was also found guilty of participating in the embezzlement and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Not done with their revenge, the TDCJ placed Stephen in solitary confinement, a place typically reserved for prisoners who pose an immediate physical threat to others around them. After dedicating years to living the high life by any means necessary, Stephen is now kept in conditions not even fit for a dog. Nights at Four Seasons hotel suites have been replaced with 22 years of sleeping in a 7-by-9-foot concrete cell. Where he once regularly ate at Michelin star restaurants, he is now fed slop barely fit for human consumption. He's only allowed out for 1 hour a day, either to shower or to stand in a cage outside. The only time he has physical contact with other people is when the guards move him into a new cell every 2 weeks to thwart any escape plans. Visits from friends and family can only happen for 2 hours once a week, with Stephen behind a thick plexiglass wall and all conversations recorded. Years of these extreme conditions have left him unable to walk without assistance, and subject to bouts of paranoia when around other people. The TDCJ has shown no interest in easing up. In addition to the end of his freedom, 1998 marked the last time Stephen would ever see his partner. Phillip was paroled in 2003 and hasn't visited Stephen once. They kept in touch through letters for a few years, but after Phillip's interview with the Houston Chronicle, all contact came to an end. The relationship that Stephen had spent years obsessing over, to the detriment of himself and those around him, is officially over. But Texas's efforts to lock Stephen away forever couldn't stop him from reaching the outside world. His escapades had grabbed the interest of Houston reporters during the '90s, and that interest has only spread over the years. On top of being the subject of articles from major publications like Esquire, NPR, and The Guardian, Steve McVicker published his biography in 2003, which was adapted into the film I Love You, Phillip Morris by screenwriter duo John Requa and Glenn Ficarra. He was also featured in shows like I Almost Got Away with It and Imposters. And then there is the autobiographical play Life After Phillip Morris, published in 2018 with the help of British journalist Laurence Watts. All this media attention gets him letters from people around the world, which he attributes his relative sanity to. It has also led to the creation of several online petitions demanding he be released. As for new escape plans, Stephen swears he has no intention of busting out again. Quote, "Setting aside my decision to give up trying to escape, escaping is now a physical impossibility for me. My spine is now so impacted that I have to be pushed around in a wheelchair whenever I leave my cell. Escaping also makes no sense now that I have served so much time. Because all of my crimes were nonviolent, I may make it out of here legitimately one day, on parole. That is an infinitely better option for me than trying to escape again." Unquote. Stephen became eligible for parole in December 2020. So far, all his requests have been denied. His next parole hearing is this November. I'll update you all on the results in the pinned comment. I don't have a lot of hope that he'll be let out, but who knows? Maybe the petitioning of the masses will finally win out over the TDCJ's ego. Maybe King Con will get to be a free man once again. Or maybe we'll hear about a wheelchair-bound 65-year-old breaking out of a maximum security prison for the 5th time. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and consider subscribing to see more videos like this one. The next one, probably not going to be out for a while because it's shaping up to be quite a doozy, but I'm looking forward to telling you guys about it. It's some real whack stuff. With that all said, I'll see you in the next video.